The cabin of United Airlines Flight 2247 sits at 35,000 feet somewhere over the dark spine of the Appalachian Mountains, and the hum of the Boeing 737-800's twin CFM56 engines has settled into that low, almost meditative frequency that usually coaxes exhausted travelers into sleep. Usually. Tonight, on a Tuesday in the gray damp throat of November, 168 passengers are wide awake, pressed against their seat backs, some craning their necks over headrests, others exchanging wide-eyed glances across the narrow aisle of row after row of blue-upholstered economy seats. Because something is happening in row 14, and every single person on this plane is holding their breath. The woman in 14C has been on her feet for 30 seconds now, and she shows no sign of sitting back down. She is somewhere in her mid-50s, highlighted blonde hair pulled into a tight ponytail that quivers when she turns her head, which she is doing rapidly, like a hawk that has spotted something small and slow moving in an open field. She is wearing a cream blazer with a wine-colored blouse underneath, and there is a large diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist that catches the cabin lighting every time she gestures, which is constantly. Her name, as her boarding pass confirms, and as she has already announced to 4 separate flight attendants, is Diane Holloway. But for the purposes of the 167 other souls trapped aboard this aircraft with her at 35,000 feet, she is about to become something else entirely. The man she is screaming at sits in 14B, directly beside her, and he has not raised his voice once. He is perhaps 60 years old, with silver hair cut close to a broad, kind face that carries the particular exhaustion of a person who has not slept properly in weeks. His name is Robert Callahan. He is wearing a dark navy suit that is just slightly too formal for a Tuesday night flight from Charlotte Douglas International to Chicago O'Hare. A flight that departed at 8:42 p.m. and is scheduled to land at 9:58 p.m. local time. The suit, if you looked closely enough and if the overhead reading light hit it at just the right angle, still has a small white rose boutonniere pinned to the lapel, its petals now wilted and browning at their edges. Robert Callahan has not removed it. He has not been able to bring himself to remove it. Diane Holloway is pointing at him. Her finger is 6 inches from his face and she is telling him, loudly enough that the flight attendant in the forward galley has already reached for the interphone, that he is disgusting, that he is selfish, that he has no right, that she paid for her seat just like everyone else and she did not pay to sit next to someone who is going to do what he is doing. What Robert Callahan is doing, or rather what he was doing before Diane Holloway erupted, is crying. Quietly, silently actually, in the way that people cry when they have been crying for so long that the tears have stopped making sound and now simply fall, tracking down a face that has learned to hold itself still through the worst kind of pain imaginable. He is pressing a folded white handkerchief to the corners of his eyes with one large, weathered hand. In his other hand, resting against his knee, is a single photograph. The photograph is of a woman. She has dark hair and an extraordinary smile, the kind of smile that seems to reach out from a photograph and hold something in your chest, and she is standing in a garden somewhere sunny, squinting a little against the light, one hand raised to shade her eyes. Written in the corner of the photograph in blue ink are the words, "My Margaret, always." Diane Holloway has told Robert Callahan to put the photograph away. She has told him that his crying is making her uncomfortable. She has told him that she has a very important business meeting in Chicago in the morning and she needs to sleep and she cannot sleep with someone sniffling next to her. And she has told him, with a precision and cruelty that has rendered the couple in 14A and 14D completely speechless, that whatever his problem is, it is not her problem and she did not get on this airplane to be subjected to it. And now every single person within earshot, which at this point is essentially every person on the aircraft, is waiting to find out what happens next. Because something is coming. They can feel it the way you feel turbulence before the seatbelt sign comes on. Something is building in this cabin, in this impossible sealed metal tube hurtling through the dark at 530 miles per hour, and there is nowhere to go, no exit, no escape, no way to put distance between yourself and what is about to unfold. And the man with the photograph, the man with the wilted boutonniere, has just looked up at Diane Holloway with the steadiest, quietest, most devastated eyes anyone on this aircraft has ever seen, and he has said, in a voice so calm it cuts through the engine noise like a blade, "My wife was buried this afternoon." Diane Holloway does not stop pointing. 43 hours earlier, Robert Daniel Callahan was standing in the kitchen of a house he had shared with Margaret and Callahan for 31 years, trying to remember how to make coffee. This sounds like a small thing, It was not a small thing. Robert and Margaret had a coffee ritual, that is the only word for it, that had evolved over 3 decades of marriage into something as fixed and sacred as a church liturgy. Margaret ground the beans herself, a particular Ethiopian Yirgacheffe roast from a specialty shop on North Michigan Avenue. Robert heated the water to exactly 205 degrees, never boiling, because Margaret had read somewhere that boiling water scalded the grounds and he had never once questioned it after that. They drank from matching blue ceramic mugs that one of their daughters had made in a pottery class when she was 12 years old. One of the mugs had a small chip in its rim on the left side. Margaret always chose that one. She said it gave character. The mug with the chip sat on the counter, empty. Robert stood in front of the coffee maker for 11 minutes before his daughter found him there, his hand resting on the canister of beans, unable to open it. This was 3 mornings after Margaret died. Margaret and Callahan, born Margaret and Riley, had been a pediatric oncology nurse at Northwestern Memorial Hospital for 22 years. She was the kind of nurse that parents of very sick children requested by name, the kind whose particular combination of clinical precision and enormous, inexhaustible human warmth made the unbearable slightly less so. She had won 3 hospital recognition awards and had been nominated for a 4th. She had coached her daughter's soccer teams, served on the board of a local literacy nonprofit, planted a garden that her neighbors would slow their cars to look at in summer. She had, by every available measure, been exactly the kind of person that the world desperately needs more of and never seems to keep long enough. The cancer had been diagnosed 14 months earlier. Pancreatic. Stage 4 by the time the symptoms announced themselves clearly enough to catch. Margaret had understood the statistics better than most people would have. She was a medical professional. She looked at the numbers, held Robert's hand across the oncologist's desk, and said, "Okay, then we have work to do." And they had worked. They had done everything the doctors recommended and several things they recommended against trying. And they had taken a trip to Ireland because Margaret's grandfather had emigrated from County Clare and she had always meant to go. And they had sat in a pub in Ennis on a rainy Thursday evening and held hands across a wooden table and not said very much, and that had been enough. Margaret died on a Saturday morning in November, in the same hospital where she had spent 22 years caring for other people's children. Robert was holding her hand. Their 2 daughters, Ellen and Grace, were in the room. The attending physician, who had known Margaret for 6 years, had to leave the room twice. The nurses on the floor left a vase of flowers outside the door with a card signed by the entire unit. The funeral was held on the following Tuesday. It was, by any reckoning, an extraordinary service. The church held 400 people and it was full. Former patients had come, or rather, the parents of former patients, adults now, people in their 30s who had been frightened children in hospital beds when Margaret had been their nurse. They sat in the pews and wept openly, which is what you do when someone who carried you through the worst moment of your life is being carried out of a church. Margaret's colleagues from Northwestern came in a group of 22, wearing their hospital badges because someone had suggested it and it seemed right. The pastor spoke for 20 minutes and then Robert stood at the podium and looked out at the people who had loved his wife and managed 11 sentences before he had to stop. Ellen and Grace held his arms on the way back to the pew. The reception afterward was at a hall on the north side of the city. And this is where the story of Flight 2247 truly begins to take shape, because among the people who came to that reception were 214 individuals from Chicago's North Shore community, from Margaret's professional world at Northwestern, from the families of her former patients, from her neighborhood, from her daughter's schools, from her book club, from her garden society, from the literacy nonprofits board. And many of those people needed to get home. Home, for a significant number of them, was scattered across the country. St. Louis, Atlanta, Dallas, Denver, and a particular cluster of 21 people whose flights were routed through Charlotte Douglas, connecting to Chicago O'Hare. Connecting on United Airlines Flight 2247. Robert had not intended to fly that evening. His daughters had begged him to stay another night. His brother-in-law had offered his guest room. But Robert needed to get home to Chicago. He needed to be in the apartment where Margaret's garden was already going brown with November cold, and where her coffee mug with the chip in the rim was sitting on a counter waiting for someone to wash it or leave it or eventually decide what to do with it. He needed to go home the way you need oxygen when you are running out of it. So he hugged his daughters, promised he would call when he landed, and made his way to the Charlotte Douglas Gate for United 2247. What Robert did not fully account for, in his exhausted and grief-stripped state, was how many of the people from the reception were on the same flight. He checked in at the United Premier desk, moved through security on automatic pilot, found the gate, and sat with his boarding pass in his hand for 20 minutes before he looked up and saw Tom Brennan, Margaret's hospital supervisor, sitting 2 seats away. Tom had nodded at him, said nothing. Sometimes there is nothing to say. That is also enough. Robert chose seat 14B on boarding. Middle seat, which he would not normally have accepted, but the window seats in his preferred exit row were gone, and he had not had the bandwidth to think about it. He sat down, placed the photograph of Margaret in his lap, and pressed his head back against the seat. He was not planning to cry. He was just trying to breathe. Diane Holloway boarded in Zone 2. She was the kind of air traveler for whom the entire apparatus of commercial aviation exists, in her view, as a personal service industry. She had already had a conflict at the gate about a bag she insisted was within carry-on dimensions when it visibly was not. Had delivered her verdict on the gate agent's competence to the agent's face with the breezy confidence of someone who had never considered that other people's feelings were a factor worth computing, and had swept down the jetway with the rolling bag in question, which had been checked without her knowledge while she was having the argument, trailing behind a gate agent, who had already forgotten her face. She settled into 14C, aisle seat, her preference, and immediately began to rearrange the overhead bin with the efficiency of a person who is certain that every bin space within 2 rows is rightfully hers. The man in 14A, a quiet retired schoolteacher named Gerald who was going home to Naperville after his cousin's birthday, moved his windbreaker slightly to the left without comment. Diane did not thank him. She did not acknowledge him. She sat down, opened her laptop, and put on noise-canceling headphones, which she then removed 17 minutes into the flight to tell the flight attendant that her Diet Coke was flat. It was somewhere over Virginia that she first noticed Robert. Or rather, noticed the quiet shake of his shoulders, the handkerchief pressed to his face, the photograph lying on his knee. She stared for a moment. Then she made a sound, a short, sharp exhalation through her nose, and turned back to her laptop. 5 minutes passed. She looked again. Robert was still crying, silently, causing no disruption to anything or anyone except, apparently, the interior atmosphere of Diane Holloway's personal bubble. She picked up her headphones, put them back down. "Excuse me," she said. Robert looked over. His eyes were red-rimmed. His expression the particular blankness of a person whose grief has moved past active pain into a kind of deep, waterlogged stillness. He waited. "I'm trying to work," Diane said. "And whatever is happening over there is very distracting." Robert looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, "I'm sorry. I'll try to be quieter." "It's not about quiet," Diane said, and here her voice took on the particular quality it would maintain for the rest of the flight. A kind of performative reasonableness masking something much less reasonable underneath. "It's about atmosphere. I have a 7 a.m. presentation tomorrow and I need to focus. I can't focus when someone is doing." She made a vague gesture toward him. "That." Robert nodded, pressed the handkerchief more firmly against his face, looked back at the photograph. That was not enough for Diane Holloway. The flight attendant who first responded to the call button from 14C was a woman named Andrea Moss, 26-year veteran of United Airlines, 17 years on mainline jets, who had in her career managed 2 medical emergencies, 1 unruly passenger diversion, and a passenger who had tried to open the emergency exit over Nebraska because, he explained afterward, he thought it was the bathroom. Andrea Moss was not a woman who was easily surprised. But when she leaned down to seat 14C and heard Diane Holloway explain that she needed the gentleman in 14B to stop crying because it was interfering with her ability to prepare for a business meeting, Andrea Moss had to call on reserves of professionalism she had not needed since the Nebraska incident. "Ma'am," Andrea said, in the voice she reserved for situations that required the maximum possible restraint. "Are you asking me to ask that passenger to stop crying?" "I'm asking you to manage the situation," Diane said, with the calm certainty of someone who has confused flight attendants with concierges for so long that the distinction has simply ceased to exist for them. "That's your job, isn't it?" Andrea straightened up. She looked at Robert Callahan. He was looking at the photograph in his hands, a man on the other side of something too large to describe to a stranger at 35,000 feet. She looked at the wilted boutonniere on his lapel. She looked back at Diane Holloway. She said, "I'll look into it," which is aviation crew speak for. "I will now go to the galley and tell my colleagues exactly what just happened, and then we will decide how to proceed." What happened in the forward galley of United 2247 over the next 4 minutes was a kind of rapid-fire professional triage. Andrea found her colleague Marcus Webb, a 10-year veteran, already aware that something was happening in row 14 because the couple in 14D, a woman named Cheryl who had been at the funeral reception, who had worked with Margaret on the literacy board for 5 years, had pressed their call button as well. Cheryl was not requesting anything. She was checking to see if the crew was aware of what was happening and if Robert Callahan was all right. She had told Marcus that the man in 14B was a widower who had buried his wife that afternoon. Marcus had gone very still for a moment. Then he had gone to find Andrea. Back in row 14, Diane Holloway had not waited for the flight attendant to return. She had removed her headphones entirely and was now turned toward Robert with the full force of her attention directed at him, the way a magnifying glass directs the full force of the sun. She told him that she understood people had problems, but that the airplane was a public shared space and there were certain standards of behavior expected in public shared spaces. She told him that she, personally, had been through plenty of difficult things in her life and she had managed to keep herself together in professional environments. She told him that the photograph he kept looking at was, frankly, a little strange, and perhaps he should put it away. It was this last sentence that caused the couple in 14D to say something loudly that was not suitable for a mixed audience but that expressed a sentiment almost universally shared in the immediate vicinity. It was this last sentence that caused Gerald in 14A to turn his head and look at Diane Holloway with an expression on his 70-year-old face that he had previously reserved for a former student who had plagiarized a paper and then lied about it to his face. And it was this last sentence that caused Robert Callahan to look up, slowly, from the photograph, and say the 8 words that would reverberate through this cabin for the rest of the flight. "My wife was buried this afternoon." The silence that followed was absolute. For a full 4 seconds, the only sound was the hum of the engines and the whisper of recycled air through the cabin ventilation system. Then Diane Holloway, who had been given the information she needed to stop, who had been handed the clearest possible reason to sit down, close her laptop, and spend the rest of this flight in the silence of her own conscience, chose instead to keep going. "Well," she said, "I'm sorry for your loss, but that still doesn't make this my problem." The woman behind row 14, seat 15B, a retired Chicago police dispatcher named Helen who had not planned to get involved, said, "Oh, good Lord," loudly enough to be heard 3 rows forward. The man in 16C put his headphones down. A woman in 13A, who had been asleep, was woken by the energy shift in the cabin the way you wake when a sound stops rather than when it starts, and she looked around with the disoriented alertness of someone who can't yet identify the threat but knows one is present. Marcus Webb appeared at the head of the aisle. He had heard the exchange from the galley. His expression, trained over a decade to remain neutral in all but the most extraordinary circumstances, had slipped toward something that was trying very hard not to be what it clearly was. He came to stand at row 14 and addressed Diane Holloway with the careful precision of a person selecting each word the way you select a wire to cut in a bomb-defusing scenario. "Ma'am, I need to ask you to please return to your seat and lower your voice." "I am in my seat," Diane said. "I need to ask you to lower your voice and direct your attention away from the passenger beside you. I'm trying to have a conversation with this passenger, which is not against any rule I'm aware of. Ma'am, if the passenger beside you is distressed and you are contributing to that distress, I am within my authority under FAA regulations to ask you to stop." Diane Holloway put her laptop on her tray table with a click that was slightly louder than necessary. "I would like to speak with the senior cabin crew member," she said. "That would be me," Andrea Moss said, appearing at Marcus's shoulder, and the particular quality of her stillness in that moment was the stillness of a person who has made a decision and is at peace with it. What happened next unfolded with the compressed, claustrophobic intensity that is unique to airline conflicts. Events that in any other setting might sprawl across hours, compressed here by the altitude and the sealed metal tube and the 168 people who cannot leave and cannot look away. Diane began telling Andrea about her rights as a paying passenger. Andrea listened. Robert Callahan had stopped looking at either of them. He had turned his head toward the window, though it was night and there was nothing to see, and he was pressing the photograph of Margaret against his sternum, his large hand flat over it like he was holding something in. And here is where the first twist came, because the woman in 15B, Helen, the retired dispatcher, had been quietly doing something with her phone. And what she had been doing was sending a text message to her former partner, a man she had worked alongside in the Chicago PD's dispatch center for 11 years, a man who happened to be sitting in seat 22A, further back in the cabin. His name was Don Esterhaus. And Don Esterhaus was not, strictly speaking, retired. Don Esterhaus was on personal leave from his current position, which was a position he had held for 4 years, which was the position of special agent in charge of the Chicago field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Don Esterhaus had been at Margaret Callahan's funeral because his daughter had been one of Margaret's patients. 12 years ago, his daughter had been 9 years old and had been diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia, and Margaret Callahan had been her nurse for the 14 months of treatment that followed. His daughter was 21 now, healthy, in her 3rd year at the University of Illinois. Don had been at the funeral because you do not forget someone like Margaret Callahan. You do not forget the person who held your child's hand and told her, at 9 years old, at 3 in the morning during the worst night of a terrible 14 months, that she was the bravest person in the building. You do not forget that, and when that person dies, you get on a plane and you go to the funeral. Don Esterhaus read Helen's text. He sat with it for a moment. Then he stood up. The aisle of a Boeing 737-800 is 21 inches wide. Don Esterhaus was a man of considerable physical presence. 6 feet 2, broad through the shoulders, with the kind of quiet authority that fills a room before the person has said anything. He moved through the cabin with the unhurried certainty of someone who has spent 23 years walking into difficult rooms and has learned that pace communicates everything. People moved their elbows off armrests without knowing why. A child in row 18 looked up from an iPad and watched him pass with wide eyes. He reached row 14 and stopped. He looked at Marcus and Andrea, who had both gone slightly still in the specific way that people go still when they recognize, on an instinctual level, that the authority structure of a situation has just shifted. He looked at Diane Holloway. He did not look at Robert Callahan yet. He said to Diane, very quietly, very clearly, "Ma'am, I need to ask you to stop speaking." Diane Holloway looked at this large, calm man who had materialized in the aisle beside her seat and said, with the confidence of someone who has never had it fail before, "And who exactly are you?" Don Esterhaus reached into his jacket. He produced a credential wallet. He held it open. He said, still quietly, still with that absolute stillness, "Federal Bureau of Investigation. Now please stop speaking." The silence that followed was of a different quality than the first silence. The first silence had been shock. This silence was something closer to the held breath before a parachute opens, that suspended moment of pure uncertainty. Diane Holloway's mouth, which had been preparing its next sentence, closed, opened, closed again. The diamond tennis bracelet caught the light as her hand, reaching toward the credential wallet in a gesture that might have been reaching to check it or reaching to push it away, dropped back to the armrest. From the galley, a second flight attendant, a young man named Kevin making only his 12th long-haul flight, later told his supervisor that the quality of sound in the cabin changed in that moment, the way sound changes in a room when someone enters who changes the room's entire equation. He said he would not forget it. Don Esterhaus turned then, for the first time, to Robert Callahan. Robert had turned from the window. He was looking at Don with those exhausted, red-rimmed eyes, and there was something in his expression that was very close to confusion, the particular confusion of a person who has been so consumed by grief that the outside world has been reaching him at a slight delay, like a signal through static. Don Esterhaus looked at him for a moment. Then he said simply, "Bob, you doing okay?" And Robert Callahan, who had been keeping himself together with the particular controlled stillness of a man who has held himself together through things that should have unmade him, put his face in his hands. Not loudly, not dramatically. The way a person finally puts something down that they have been carrying for too long. Diane Holloway was watching all of this, and something was beginning to happen in her face. The architecture of her expression, which had been built on the load-bearing assumption that she was the most consequential person in any given room, was showing its first structural cracks. She was looking at the FBI agent, who clearly knew the man she had just told that his grief was not her problem, who had come from somewhere further back in the cabin, which meant there were more people on this flight who, and here her gaze began to travel, for the first time since boarding, up and down the aisle, actually looking at the other passengers, actually registering them as people with context, with history, with their own stakes in whatever was happening in row 14. What she saw, if she was looking carefully, and she was beginning to, was this: the woman in 15B who was watching her with the expression of a person who has seen people make catastrophic mistakes from a position of false confidence and has learned to recognize the moment they first understand what they've done. The couple in 14D, one of whom was crying quietly, clutching a funeral program that Diane could now see had a photograph on the cover. A dark-haired woman with an extraordinary smile. The man in 16C who had his phone out, and who had been holding it out for the past 4 minutes. The woman in 13A who had not gone back to sleep and was not going to. And further back. She couldn't see this, but she was about to be told. Another 11 people scattered through the cabin who had driven to the church that morning and driven to the reception that afternoon and then driven to the Charlotte Douglas Airport and boarded this flight, all of them here because of the woman in the photograph, the woman with the extraordinary smile squinting into garden sunlight, the woman whose name was Margaret. Andrea Moss had stepped away to the interphone. She was speaking to the cockpit. The captain of United 2247 was a 20-year veteran named Captain Patricia Reyes. And when Andrea finished telling her what was happening in row 14, Captain Reyes was quiet for 3 seconds, then said, "Thank you, Andrea. I'm going to make a PA." The cabin speaker crackled to life with the particular tone that causes every passenger on every commercial flight to look up from whatever they're doing. The instinctive attentional response to a captain's address. Captain Reyes's voice came through with the calm, measured authority of someone very comfortable speaking to people in the middle of difficult moments. "Folks, this is your captain. I want to take a moment to address something happening aboard our aircraft this evening. It has been brought to my attention that we have a passenger with us tonight, in row 14, who is traveling home after losing his wife today. As many of you know, a number of passengers on this flight attended the same memorial service this afternoon, and we are all very much aware of the gravity of this evening for this individual and for this community of people aboard our aircraft. I want to say directly, we will not tolerate any behavior that compounds the suffering of a person in this situation. That is not the standard of this airline, and it is not the standard we hold on this aircraft. We have approximately 47 minutes remaining in our flight. I ask that every passenger be mindful of the company we are keeping this evening. Thank you." The silence after the PA lasted approximately 4 seconds. And then something happened that Kevin, the young flight attendant on his 12th flight, would talk about for the rest of his career. It started in row 22, where Tom Brennan, Margaret's hospital supervisor, began to applaud. It moved forward and backward from there with a speed that suggested it was not applause being started so much as applause being released, the way you release a held breath or the way water moves once a dam is opened. By the time it reached full volume, it included, by later accounts, 141 of the 168 people aboard, some of them people who had no personal connection to the Callahan family and did not know why they were clapping until they had already started, pulled in by the current of the thing, understanding only that something was happening in this cabin that needed to be marked. Robert Callahan had his face in his hands. He did not see this. He felt it. The sound of it moved through the recycled air of the cabin and found him in row 14, and he lowered his hands slowly. He looked forward. He looked behind. 141 people, some crying, some standing in their rows. Tom Brennan in row 22 with his hand over his heart. Cheryl in 14D, who had worked with Margaret for 5 years, reaching across the aisle to touch Robert's arm. Diane Holloway was the only person in the cabin who was not clapping. She sat in 14C with her laptop closed on her tray table and her hands in her lap and the expression of a person who has just understood, all at once and completely, the full dimensions of what she has done. Don Esterhaus was still standing in the aisle beside her row. He did not look at her. He was looking at Robert Callahan. His expression was the expression of a man performing a small private act of witnessing. The clapping subsided. The engines hummed. The seatbelt sign illuminated with a chime, indicating the initial descent into Chicago had begun. Don Esterhaus, once the noise had died down, turned his attention back to Diane Holloway. He told her, without raising his voice, that he needed her to understand several things. He told her that he had been present for the duration of the incident in row 14, that he had observed her behavior directly and at close range, and that what he had witnessed constituted, at minimum, a potential violation of Title 49, United States Code, Section 46318, which governs interference with flight crew members and other aircraft personnel, and potentially additional statutes concerning disruptive and threatening behavior aboard a commercial aircraft. He told her that Andrea and Marcus and every other crew member aboard this aircraft had the full legal authority to have this flight diverted. He told her that the decision whether to pursue charges upon landing at O'Hare would be made in consultation with the airline, the crew, and... He paused here, and the pause was deliberate, the affected passenger. Diane Holloway's face had gone through several colors during this recitation. It had passed through red and arrived at a pale, waxy gray. "I didn't know," she started. "That is," Don Esterhaus said, "not a legal defense." Andrea Moss had been on the interphone again. When she returned to row 14, she informed Diane Holloway that the airline's ground operations team at O'Hare had been notified of the incident, that law enforcement was being requested for the gate, and that the airline would be reviewing the matter in full upon landing, including in the context of its zero-tolerance policy for passenger misconduct. She also told Diane that she would need to remain in her seat for the duration of the flight, that she would be the last passenger to deplane, and that members of law enforcement would be meeting the aircraft at the gate. She then turned to Robert Callahan. She crouched down beside his seat, eye level, the way experienced flight attendants do when a passenger needs to feel spoken to and not spoken at, and she told him that the crew of United 2247 was deeply sorry for his loss, and deeply sorry for the events of this flight, and that if there was anything she or any member of the crew could do for the remainder of the flight, he needed only to ask. She also told him that the airline's customer relations team would be in contact regarding this incident, and that on behalf of United Airlines she could already assure him that his comfort and dignity would be taken seriously. Robert Callahan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "Thank you. She would have liked this. Margaret. She always said people were essentially good." He paused. "She was usually right." Andrea Moss had to stand up and walk back to the galley before her expression did something unprofessional. The descent into O'Hare took 41 minutes. For those 41 minutes, the cabin of United 2247 maintained the particular quality of shared silence that falls over a group of people who have experienced something together that they will not forget. People who had not spoken to their seatmates for the entire flight found themselves talking quietly. A woman in row 9 passed a packet of tissues to the woman in front of her without explanation, and the woman in front took two without turning around. Kevin, the flight attendant, made his way through the cabin with water and a composure he was privately very proud of. In row 22, Tom Brennan sat with his boarding pass in his hands and thought about Margaret and about the corridor outside her office at Northwestern where her colleagues had left flowers, and about the first week after his daughter's diagnosis 23 years ago when he had not known how he was going to manage the unit without thinking about it every minute, and how Margaret had come into his office on a Thursday afternoon and said, "You're allowed to be a person and a manager at the same time, Tom." He had kept that. In row 14, Robert Callahan sat with the photograph of Margaret in his lap and the wilted boutonniere on his lapel and the fold of his dark navy suit arranged neatly over his knees, and he was not crying. He was looking at the photograph. His face had the expression of a person doing something very difficult and finding that they can, in fact, do it. When the wheels touched down at O'Hare at 10:07 p.m., 9 minutes behind schedule, the delay attributable to an unspecified cabin matter, he took a slow breath and put the photograph carefully in the breast pocket of his jacket, against his chest, and sat quietly while the aircraft taxied. Diane Holloway deplaned last, as instructed, escorted by Andrea, Marcus, and met at the gate by 2 Chicago Police Department officers who had been requested by the airline's ground team. She was not arrested at the gate. The situation was more complicated than that and more drawn out, which in some ways made it worse. The officers took her information. They requested she remain in the terminal. Don Esterhaus, who had given a statement to the crew before deplaning, had left his card with Andrea Moss and spoken briefly by phone with the airline's security coordinator. The full accounting would take time. These things always do. What the accounting eventually produced was this. Diane Holloway was placed on United Airlines' internal no-travel list pending a conduct review, a process that was initiated within 48 hours of the incident and completed with a determination that she had violated the airline's contract of carriage terms governing disruptive behavior. She was permanently banned from United Airlines. The legal question, complicated by jurisdictional considerations and the specifics of the applicable federal statute, ultimately resulted in a civil citation and a fine. Don Esterhaus, who had provided a formal account of the incident in his capacity as a federal law enforcement officer who had personally witnessed the events, confirmed that his account had been received by the relevant authorities and would be part of the permanent record. The incident was also reported by two journalists who had been on the flight, one a local Chicago television reporter returning from a story in Charlotte, one a freelance travel writer, both of whom had documented portions of what they'd witnessed. The accounts that followed, carefully worded to avoid identifying Robert Callahan by full name, described the broad strokes of what had happened in row 14. They traveled, as these accounts do, far and quickly. United Airlines issued a statement within 72 hours, reaffirming its policy on passenger conduct and noting that the airline was committed to the dignity of all travelers, particularly those experiencing bereavement. The statement also announced the expansion of its existing bereavement travel policy and the introduction of additional crew training protocols for supporting passengers in acute emotional distress. Robert Callahan received a formal apology from United Airlines' senior customer relations team, a full refund and travel credit, and an upgrade to Polaris business class for any future travel, valid for 5 years. He received these with the particular quiet graciousness of a person who is at peace with the outcomes because the only outcome that ever really mattered is the one that happened months before, in a hospital room on a Saturday morning in November with his daughters beside him and Margaret's hand in his, and no airline can address that and no amount of travel credit can touch it. What the airline statement could not mention, because the people involved had not authorized the disclosure, was the handwritten note that Robert received 2 weeks after the flight, forwarded through the airline, from a woman named Cheryl who had worked with Margaret on the Literacy Nonprofits Board for 5 years. The note said that she hoped he was all right, and that she had been thinking about him, and that Margaret had spoken about him often, always with the particular pride of someone who is describing something they feel lucky to have. She said that Margaret had called him, once, over a board meeting coffee, my steadiest person, and Cheryl thought he should know that. Robert kept this note. He kept it in the drawer of the nightstand on Margaret's side of the bed, beside the photograph from the garden, beside the coffee mug with the chip in the rim that he had eventually washed and returned to the cabinet and could not quite bring himself to give away. Ellen and Grace called every morning for the first month. Then every other morning. They came for Thanksgiving, all 4 of them in the apartment with Margaret's garden browning below the window, and they cooked the recipes she had left in her recipe box, the one she had written out in blue ink on index cards, and they talked about her all through dinner and for hours afterward, and at some point someone laughed at a memory and then someone else laughed and the laughter moved around the table and Robert sat at the head of it feeling, for the first time in weeks that time was, not standing still, that the next thing was still coming, even when you had not asked for it and were not ready. That breath continued whether you organized it or not. He planted the garden again the following spring. He asked the specialty shop on North Michigan Avenue to show him what Ethiopian Yirgacheffe roast Margaret had always ordered, and the shop owner, who had known Margaret, told him the exact variety and wrote it down on a card so he would not have to remember. He found he could heat the water to 205 degrees without looking at the thermometer. The body learns the important things and holds them. And on a Tuesday in the following November, exactly 1 year after, Robert Callahan bought a ticket on a United Airlines flight from Chicago to Charlotte. His daughters met him at the airport. They drove to the church together in the autumn light, and the garden in the photograph Margaret had loved so much, the place where the picture had been taken, the garden behind her parents' house in the South Charlotte suburb where she had grown up, was deep in October brown and beautiful in the way that things are beautiful when they know they will come back. Robert stood at her graveside with his daughters beside him and the wilted boutonniere from the year before in the breast pocket of his dark navy suit, and he told her about the spring garden and the coffee and the mug and the notes from Cheryl and all the things that had happened in the year since she went away, and how people were still, essentially mostly good just like she always said. He said, she was right. He said, she was usually right. What happened on Flight 2247 on a Tuesday night in November was a small thing, measured against the full weight of what Robert Callahan was carrying. It was a woman who did not see a person and a widower who did not need to be seen and still was, by 141 people who clapped in a sealed metal tube at 35,000 feet because sometimes the human response to grief and cruelty and the confined impossibility of a situation is simply to make noise, to say collectively and out loud. We see this, we are here, this matters. It matters. The person beside you on the aircraft has a life you cannot see from the aisle. They have a mug with a chip in the rim at home, and a garden, and a name for the person they lost. And the journey they are on is one that began long before they sat down in 14B, and will continue long after the wheels touch ground. The courtesy of shared space is not merely policy. It is recognition. It is the acknowledgement that the person beside you is a person, full and complete and carrying things you cannot measure. Share the story. Not because of the woman who got it wrong, but because of the 141 people who got it right. Because of Andrea Moss and her 26 years of grace under pressure. Because of Tom Brennan in row 22 with his hand over his heart. Because of Don Esterhaus who stood up and walked forward because someone who mattered to him had mattered to the man in 14B. Because of Captain Patricia Reyes, whose voice came through the speakers with the calm and weight of someone who understood exactly what she was doing. Because of Robert Callahan, who cried quietly on a night flight with a photograph on his knee and a wilted flower on his lapel, and who said, when it was over, that his wife always believed people were essentially good. He's still flying United. And every time the wheels leave the ground and the altitude climbs and the engines settle into that low meditative hum at 35,000 feet, he puts his hand against his breast pocket where the photograph is.